Okay, so we're going to get started. So welcome everyone to this month's seminar of the Working Group on Active B-Stars. Our speaker today is Akira Rocha. Kyle did his undergrad at UC Santa Cruz and is currently a grad student at Northwestern University. Kyle is interested in stellar and binary evolution and systems hosting compact objects. And today we'll be talking to us about the role of rotation in Galactic Be X-ray binaries. So, Kyle, the image seems to be flickering on and off. Currently, I'm seeing a black screen. Oh, okay. Let's try that again.
Yeah, let me try again.
Sure. Okay. Perfect. All right. So without further ado, Kyle, please take it away.
Yes, thank you for that introduction. Yeah, I just like to say a little bit about myself. So my name is Akira Rocha, a graduate student at Northwestern University. And today I'm going to be telling you about this project that we're hoping to finish very soon, titled To Be or Not to Be, the Role of Rotation in Modeling Galactic Be-XRB binaries. And y'all can still see the slides advancing?
Yep, looking great.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so today I have a little bit of an outline for you. I'm going to start by reviewing some of the observational properties of Be-XRB binaries and sort of try and describe how we came to understand sort of the theoretical picture for these systems. Then I'm going to go into some detail about the different modeling paradigms that we use to study these systems. And then that will transition into the actual study that we did, modeling galactic Be-XRB binaries with a binary population synthesis code called POSYDON, which I will describe later. But first, what are Be-XRB binaries? So, as many people probably already know, the donors in Be-XRB binaries are considered classical Be stars, which get their name from the spectral type, that's the Be, and the Balmer emission lines seen attributed to a circumstellar decretion disk that's emanating from the central Be star. And so sort of the formation of the disk or the launching of the disk, we often refer to as the Be phenomenon. And these emission lines are important because it allows us to track the morphology and the evolution of the disk itself. And in general, we see that these disks can evolve on human timescales, so months to years. And the H-alpha line profile in particular is used to sort of probe different features of the disk. And another property of Be stars at large is that as a population, they're observed to be very rapidly rotating from as a fraction of the critical rotation rate down to 0.3 all the way up to 0.95. Here is a distribution of sort of the inferred true equatorial rotational velocity for a large statistical sample of Be stars, trying to consider lots of different systematic biases that may be introduced by trying to measure rotation rates, because it's actually quite difficult. But the point here is that there's sort of a peak around 0.6, 0.7, and that the distribution is also very broad. And the origins of the rotation, why these Be stars are spinning so rapidly, remains a question that people are interested in studying in both in observational studies, trying to measure what this distribution looks like, and from a theoretical perspective. And one of the main sort of theories for how you can get rapid rotation is in a binary. And so naturally, Be X-ray binaries are already in a binary configuration. And so this is kind of one of the interesting things about Be X-ray binaries. And in their name, you have X-ray. So we see high energy emission from these binaries. Here I'm showing two X-ray light curves of two different systems. And the X-ray light curve is on the top. And on the bottom panel is showing the equivalent width of the H alpha line. And the equivalent width is essentially a measure of the strength of the emission. And as I mentioned before, we use this line and different features like the equivalent width to sort of track the evolution and the morphology of the disk. And what you should see is that the X-ray outbursts are seen to correlate with the H alpha evolution or the disk evolution. So there seems to be a connection between the high energy emission from these systems and the disk evolution. And as a population, we can also look at their orbital properties. So here's on the vertical axis is the eccentricity versus log orbital period. So these are just the orbital parameters of different high mass X-ray binaries, where the red are supergiant high mass X-ray binaries. So they also contain high mass donor stars, but their main mode of accretion in those cases is with the strong stellar winds of the evolved companion. And then you can see at sort of these larger, like tens to hundreds of days orbital periods, you have the Be X-ray binaries. And here's just showing some galactic and also some Be-XRB binaries in the SMC. And the main point here is that as a population, they're generally in these sort of wider orbits, and they're more eccentric than some of the other high mass X-ray binaries that we know about. And so all of this sort of information has led to this picture of what we consider a Be-XRB binary is, which it contains a classical Be star that has a circumstellar disk. The Be stars in these systems seem to also be rapidly rotating. And there's a compact object in the system that at periastron passages or close approaches to the Be star, it can accrete some of the circumstellar material from the decretion disk. And then it leads to these periodic X-ray outbursts that allow us to detect and characterize these systems. So this is sort of the nice, sort of clean picture, theoretically, that we have of Be-XRB binaries. Why are we interested in studying these in particular? So Be-XRB binaries make up a majority of all known high mass X-ray binaries. So we have a large sample of these systems. The fact that they have a compact object in the system and a high mass star means that they're potential compact object merger progenitors. And so these systems are interesting in that context. And because we think that these systems evolve through binary stellar interactions, the observed population is naturally a probe for the different physical processes that these systems go through. And the fact that they contain Be stars at all means that they can also be interesting probes for just general stellar evolution, things like stars undergoing extremely rapid rotation. So that was kind of the data and sort of observational picture of what we think Be-XRB binaries are. And I wanted to pause quickly before I move on to some of the more theoretical modeling and see if anyone had questions. All right. Then I will go on. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier a few times that there's this binary stellar evolution scenario that we believe can form systems that look like Be-XRB binaries. So what do I mean by that? So here on the left, I'm showing a schematic where time is advancing from top to bottom, and it's depicting some of the primary interactions that a binary star system can undergo. And so initially, you get a massive binary with 2 stars born, evolving nicely on the main sequence. As the primary or the more massive star evolves, it generally expands and can fill its Roche lobe and start transferring mass via Rocha lobe mass transfer. And the accretor then can accrete some of this material and its specific angular momentum, causing the secondary to be spun up. And so as the primary is more massive, it evolves on a shorter time scale, and it can end its life in a supernova forming the first compact object. And if this binary system survives the supernova, meaning if it doesn't evaporate, it remains gravitationally bound, then we're left with the secondary, which is still well on the main sequence, rapidly rotating, and a compact object. And so this is the general picture that we have of how you can form these rapidly rotating Be stars and get them in a binary with a compact object. And so I would say that there's many different ways to theoretically study these systems. There's lots of work looking at Be stars under the influence of a compact object. People interested in the disk. I'm coming at this from a stellar evolution perspective and thinking about if our understanding of stellar evolution can reproduce these systems. And so I'm going to talk about 2 main modeling paradigms, being rapid binary population synthesis and detailed stellar evolution. But I'm going to start first with sort of the rapid binary population synthesis and describe a little bit what sort of the modeling techniques they use are. So here's a incomplete list of a few binary population synthesis codes that people use to do their research. And there's a large diversity of codes that people use because there's lots of different physics that we have to model. And people often make different choices about how to model these different phases. And so what often happens is there's so many choices to be made. It is sometimes easier for people to just write their entirely new binary population synthesis code than edit maybe a pre-existing one. However, a large fraction of them rely on the same methodology, which we call single star evolution, or SSE. And this is particularly important in the context of this phase of evolution, where there's Rocha-Bowfield mass transfer, because I'll describe what single star evolution is on the next slide, but just to emphasize this phase of evolution, the stars are evolving individually, but as they lose mass or gain mass for the accretor, they're also evolving and responding to that mass gain or mass loss in a non-trivial way. And this is the hard calculation to do in binary star evolution, where you're trying to see how the star responds and how mass transfer proceeds for any given system. So how does SSE or single star evolution work in the context of binary star evolution? So here on the left, I'm showing a time series of the radius evolution of a 5 solar mass star. And the dashed dotted line is showing a fit, an analytic fitting formula that was parameterized and fit to match the results of detailed models. And one of the reasons why you might do this is because running these detailed models is expensive. But when you're doing binary population synthesis, you're interested in generating a large population of systems. And so it's no longer feasible to run 1 million detailed models if you want to approximate a small fraction of the galaxy, or worse, you wanted to do some sort of like entire universe evolution of X-ray binaries. So this is sort of the motivation for this. And what you get is when you have these analytic fitting formula, you can approximate the evolution of a single star, and it's computationally almost instantaneous compared to running the detailed models. So what happens when a star is actually losing mass? Because these single star models are run in isolation. So how can we actually approximate the interactions of a binary undergoing mass, or a star undergoing mass gain or mass loss through these interactions? And here I'm showing just a toy HR diagram where this is sort of the main sequence for different stars at different masses. And this is the Hertzsprung gap for these different massive stars. But let's say that as it evolves off the main sequence, it expands and starts, it initiates Rocha overflow mass transfer at some point in this track. What is done is, if this star is losing mass, let's say it's the more massive star and it's donating mass, then we will jump to an interpolated, again, another single star track, but at an equivalent evolutionary phase. But again, we're just jumping to another single star model. And so there's no way to self-consistently evolve the star's response to mass gain, mass loss, etc. And this is also done in binary population synthesis to change, for example, the wind prescription. And so there's some modularity with binary population synthesis, but at the cost of needing to make this physical approximation for the complex interactions that the binaries undergo. So I mentioned rapid binary population synthesis already, and I'm going to contrast it with maybe the detailed binary evolution with sort of a standard like one-dimensional stellar evolution code, something like MESA. And this is sort of the detailed modeling that I was describing before. But what you get is self-consistent modeling for energy generation and transport within the stellar interior, the star's response, structural response to mass loss and gain. You have spin-orbit coupling, so you can try and model things like rotation, mixing processes, etc. But doing all this, as I described, is very computationally expensive. And for codes like MESA, you can't necessarily model the supernova, for example. But in the formation scenario I described before, there's lots of other binary interaction processes that need to be modeled. And while I describe some of the pitfalls of the modeling of rapid binary population synthesis, it is computationally inexpensive. And so these codes are able to produce hundreds of millions of binary evolutions. And because of that, they can have better population statistics, they can do wider parameter studies, and they can evolve a binary from ZAMs all the way to compact object merger, if that's the case study. And yes, I already described some of these poor physical approximations that have to be done in order to achieve this computational speed up. And so part of the work that I'm doing at Northwestern is asking, what if we could get the best of both worlds? Meaning, we would love to have the physical accuracy of these more detailed binary stellar evolution models, but it's quite computationally expensive. We would love to combine the physical accuracy of these models with a population synthesis framework so that we can generate large samples of systems and do our standard population statistics and parameter studies. But this hasn't necessarily been done before, because you immediately run into huge computational challenges if you try and combine these two, as I mentioned. And I can get into a little more detail about how challenging it is, but it's quite expensive to consider tackling this problem in terms of computation. And so enter POSYDON. This is the binary population synthesis code that we are trying to develop. I am a part of a larger team of people who are putting a huge amount of effort in trying to get this code put together. The code is public, and version 1 of it exists right now. And yeah, just wanted to highlight the fact that I'm a developer, but it takes a large team of people to put a project like this together. And so how are we actually trying to solve these problems that I alluded to, these computational challenges? The main sort of bread and butter that we're using is called emulation, which is essentially a machine learning model that's been trained on the results of these detailed binary evolution simulations. And what the machine learning model does is it can take a discrete grid of simulations in parameter space, and it will predict the outcomes of detailed simulations after learning the trends in the data that you've given it. And the way that this kind of solves one of these problems is that while it can be expensive to train some machine learning algorithms, similar to the SSE, once you've trained it, it's quite inexpensive to compute predictions for. And so we can spend a lot of computations in running detailed binary models, but and training the machine learning algorithms, but making the actual predictions is quite fast. So back to this physical picture of binary cell evolution, where does this sort of machine learning emulation framework fit in? We've focused in this first version of POSYDON on the phases of evolution where Rocha orbital mass transfer is occurring. So this includes phases where there's 2 hydrogen-rich stars, and phases where there's a hydrogen-rich star and a compact object, and a helium star and a compact object. As these phases of evolution, it's critical to track what the star's response is to those interactions, the mass gain and the mass loss. So here's a pictorial representation of the results of MESA simulations, where the x-axis is like the initial mass of one of the stars, and the vertical axis is the initial orbital period, where each of these dots represent the result of a simulation. And so it's some like characteristic outcome of the simulation. We run these models. We use this as training data for a machine learning algorithm, and then we use that in place of this phase of evolution where mass transfer is occurring. So what does that look like? Here I'm showing the actual models and hiding a lot of the points for now. So again, the vertical axis is the initial orbital period, and the horizontal axis is the initial mass of the primary. And the 2 different panels are showing the mass ratio, 2 different mass ratios. So that's setting the mass of the secondary star in these simulations. And these configurations are 2 hydrogen-rich stars. And the main sort of islands I'm trying to highlight here are regions where, first of all, there's no mass transfer in some parts of parameter space, where they're too wide or too massive to interact on the timescale that we evolved these systems for. But there's huge islands where there's lots of mass transfer and interactions happening. And these sort of regions of stable versus unstable mass transfer are quite complex. They're not as simple as some of the parameterizations that are often used in rapid binary population synthesis. And what do I mean by stable or unstable? It's essentially in unstable mass transfer, the star's response or the orbit's response to mass transfer can cause sort of a runaway reaction where the mass transfer rate keeps increasing due to initiating mass transfer. And so what you eventually initiate in unstable mass transfer is what's called a common envelope event, where the stars plunge into each other's envelopes and have this dynamical in spiral phase. And this is a completely different sort of evolution than if mass transfer had proceeded stably. You still have a detached binary before the first supernovae. So when you resolve the details of mass transfer, it determines which parts of the parameter space map to this common envelope channel that I described before, or the stable mass transfer channel. And people often talk about this in the context of compact object mergers seen by LIGO, Virgo, Kagra, for example. And so this has implications for lots of other fields that rely on binary population synthesis models to do their science. So now I'm showing actually all the little points on this plot. All the different colors in these different regions are sort of showing a different when mass transfer occurred. So we have lots of detailed information about these models and can know the evolutionary state of each star. And that's what's being shown on the right. I'm highlighting the fact here that I'm only showing one slice in mass ratio now, where the right panel is what I was showing on the previous slide, but the left panel is now showing the same parameter space, but now each marker is color-coded by the rotation of the accretor. So it's divided by in units of the critical rotation. And so you can see this island where there's lots of stable mass transfer. The accretors are getting spun up to very high fractions of their critical rotation. And we get to resolve this kind of behavior when we have the simultaneous evolution of both stars in MESA's binary module. And so these are sort of this was like a bit of a deep dive into the detailed models of POSYDON. We use these to replace some of these complicated phases of evolution where there's important interactions to resolve well, including things like mass transfer. And this is especially important for our systems of interest, the Be-XRB binaries, because we've already identified the fact that the Be donors in these systems, one of their signatures is the fact that they're rapidly rotating. And so that was sort of a deep dive into POSYDON. And now I'm going to transition into talking about our specific study using POSYDON to look at the Galactic Be X-ray binary population. I wanted to pause and see if there were any questions. All right. So back to Be-XRB binaries. So in our binary population synthesis models, this is a schematic similar to the one I was showing before of the binary solution interactions, but sort of detailing how we look at it from more of a modeling perspective. So we have to make some decisions about the initial conditions for our binaries. We draw from some mass orbital period distribution that's motivated by observations. We start all of our binaries in circular orbits with their rotation synchronized to the orbital period. And this is assuming that they're tidally locked, essentially. Then we use the results of these detailed models that I was describing before to determine the outcome of evolution for these binaries that we're Monte Carlo drawing in the standard binary population synthesis sort of way. Then the results of our simulations tell us which systems will undergo unstable mass transfer and lead to a common envelope, or systems which remain stable and will eventually end their lives as the primary undergoes core collapse. Then we we model supernova explosions using sort of standard binary population synthesis techniques where we try and incorporate the results of more detailed sort of 2D and 3D supernova simulations and try and use those on each of the binaries that's undergoing supernova. And then we have this subpopulation of systems that survive the supernova kicks, for example, or the mass loss, remain bound they have a compact object and a star. So these are potential X-ray binary configurations. They're generally in eccentric orbits because they've undergone some kind of mass loss or kick from the supernovae. And during this phase of evolution, this is where we're interested in looking at more detail at our population because they're potentially in an X-ray binary phase in this configuration. And we do a time sampling as the binary evolves. So the star is going to evolve, the orbit's going to evolve due to tides, due to the mass loss from the star's winds, etc. And so we do some time sampling of the evolution of the system during the so-called detached phase because there's no Rocha orbital mass transfer during this X-ray binary phase. So now I'm going to describe some of the modeling during this phase that we incorporate to try and match closer and closer to what we think Be X-ray binary should look like. So first, we want to apply a weighting that to first order is approximately the probability of observing these systems. And the main idea here is that longer lived systems, you should be more likely to detect given some random viewing of the galaxy. And so we weight each of the time samples of the binary in this configuration by its lifetime in this detached phase. Then we make decisions about which stars in these binaries should appear as BE stars. And because we've explicitly modeled rotation and done lots of work to run those models, we actually have a prediction here from modeling as opposed to just sort of an assumption about what the birth spin distribution should be for these stars in their X-ray binary phase. And we make a cut saying anything above 0.5 should efficiently form the disk and essentially appear as a BE star, as long as it's above this critical threshold rotation rate. And we also make a cut on the mass of the donor, saying 3 is close to the low end of the B spectral types formally. And just saying anything that's less massive than this wouldn't appear as a high mass X-ray binary. And as we were talking about before, these systems produce lots of high energy emission that actually allows us to identify the fact that there's a compact object in these systems. And so we need to, first, we break this up into 2 parts. First, we try and determine which binaries are in orbital configurations to actually have some interaction with the disk. That is the gravitational capture of the circumstellar material producing the X-ray outburst. And so we have a disk model that gives us the outer radius of the disk, and we check this disk radius relative to the periastron separation of the binaries, and just simply say that if the orbit is close enough to touch the disk, then there should be some interaction. For the X-ray luminosity, we use the results of this recent Be-XRB study, where they've shown that what this plot is showing is the mass accretion rate onto a compact object accreting from a BE star disk as a function of the periastron distance. This is the 1 minus E, the eccentricity, times the semi-major axis. And they show that it basically scales as a power law. And these are the results of SPH simulations, trying to model the disk interactions under the gravitational perturbation of a compact object. And they find that the X-ray luminosity is sort of proportional to the scaling that you get with the periastron distance. And there's some normalization factors like what you assume the density of the disk is and the mass of the compact object, etc. But we use the results of this SPH simulation to calculate the X-ray luminosity. We have a threshold X-ray luminosity, and then we say everything above this threshold is considered detectable. So those are all the ingredients that we're using to try and put everything together for this picture of what we think Be-XRB binaries should look like from a modeling perspective. So here, what I'm showing is the orbital properties. On the vertical axis is the eccentricity versus log of the orbital period of first sort of a baseline population to consider what our selection criteria and our modeling criteria actually accomplish. So this is showing a result of the time sampling of the evolution of all of the binaries that we have in our population, of every binary that has a compact object and a star. There's no cuts on mass or anything. So this is sort of like the candidate X-ray binary population, so to speak. Now I'm showing the same population, but we're using our Be-XRB binary modeling and selection criteria, including the rotation, the donor mass, the X-ray luminosity, and the X-ray interaction. And overlaying, we have a catalog of Galactic Be X-ray binaries from this recent Fortin et al. 2023. And the arrows up here indicate systems for which only the orbital period was measured. But the takeaway here is that with our fiducial binary population synthesis, we have like one realization of binary population synthesis physics and one realization of this Be-XRB binary modeling criteria, which include all these different effects, that we get this really good matching between, I would argue, quite striking matching between the orbital properties of the observed galactic Be-XRB binaries. To sort of look at further why we're getting this matching, we wanted to look at what including rotation is doing to sort of select the systems that have this nice matching with the galactic distribution. So we looked, so what I'm going to show on the right hand side is one-dimensional parameter histograms of individual parameters for like the rotation distribution, donor mass distribution, compact object, and eccentricity distribution. And looking at what, if we had just used a cut on rotation, or had just said, okay, we're not going to explicitly model rotation, but we know that BE stars have this kind of mass range. So what you should be thinking about, the difference between the green and the pink, is the difference between explicitly modeling rotation from the population synthesis perspective and just having a donor mass cut saying all these things should look like Be-XRBs. And what I'll highlight here is the fact that in the rotation distribution, the donor mass really is pretty agnostic to what rotation rate you have, and it extends down to much lower rotation rates. And in donor mass, you can see, again, the donor mass cut is quite straightforward. It's just greater than 3. But rotation is actually selecting the right mass range alone. And we understand this from the fact that the lower limit is essentially being set by magnetic braking. And so if you select things that are spinning very fast, you kind of deselect all of the lowest mass stars in your population. And the high mass end is being set by the stronger winds of the high mass stars, causing those extremely massive stars to preferentially spin down faster as the winds take away angular momentum, spinning momentum from the star. In sort of the compact object space, we also see that as consistent with the observed population, we generally get a large majority of neutron star companions to black hole companions for our Be-XRB binaries. And in eccentricity, we also exclude circular systems. And the way we understand this is due to the tidal evolution, because tidal circularization is slower than tidal synchronization, and that is the spins of the stars in the binaries. So if you have become circular through tides, then you are necessarily tidally synchronized. And for an orbit of like 10 days or even, that's some of the tidal orbital periods. If you convert this into what fraction of critical you're spinning, it's like less than 1%. And so if you assert that things have to be spinning fast, you exclude all the systems that have circularized due to tides. And so our explicit modeling of rotation is giving us this nice matching between the orbital properties of Be-XRB binaries. Here is a bit of a deeper look into just the rotational distribution at different phases of evolution of our Be-XRB binaries. So starting with the blue, this is the rotational distribution where everything is synchronized starting at ZAMs. And you can see everything is generally very subcritical. But as you move to the red distribution, this is a snapshot of the distribution right after mass transfer. You can see the whole distribution is shifted to very high rotation rates. And then you get this bimodal peak where these are primarily driven, the peak that's shifting to higher fractions of critical rotation is being driven by this TAMS evolution, or it's the structural evolution on the main sequence, where a star will, as it evolves and expands, it will become more and more critically rotating. And then naturally, these stars will generally spin down due to tides. And so this peak kind of shifts to the left as well. And so, yeah, the main takeaways that rotation that we're seeing in the X-ray binary phase is a direct result of the mass transfer during the part of the evolution where they're both hydrogen-rich stars. And we sort of get this bimodal rotational distribution during their X-ray binary phase with a peak at 0.6, which, if you remember, is tantalizingly close to the observed distribution of rotation rates of BE stars. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the mass transfer physics during this phase, because it's giving us our birth spin distribution during the X-ray binary phase, and it's also allowing us to select properties of the observed Be-XRB binary population. For example, the period eccentricity distribution, you could almost select just using rotation. And so we're interested in looking more at the physics during this phase where there's two hydrogen-rich stars. So here I'm showing the time series evolution of just the mass evolution of the primary in blue and the secondary. And as you can see, this is the terminal age main sequence of the primary. So the primary expands shortly after it leaves TAMS. It initiates Rocha-Boberful mass transfer, which is why the mass suddenly goes down a lot, because it's donating its mass to the secondary. And the secondary starts accreting some of this material, but it stops quickly because we have implemented in our detailed binary models what we call rotationally limited accretion. And that is that we allow the stars to spin and we model the spin evolution. But if the spin, as the spin approaches critical, we have a boosted wind from the accretor that sort of scales as the fraction, how close to critical you are. So what this boosted wind does is it actually keeps the stars from spinning critically. And so what you see is the secondary is unable to accept all of the mass that the primary is giving it because of this rotationally limited accretion that we've implemented. And then there is a second phase of mass transfer that's very short-lived right before the supernova. And this phase of sort of stagnation in between the first phase of mass transfer, you actually have created a stripped helium star. And so you've essentially ejected lots of this hydrogen-rich envelope as CSM, and you have this helium core left over, and then the helium core starts evolving at TAMS, initiating the second phase of mass transfer, but it's right before the supernova, essentially. So temporally, it doesn't look significant. And then this is sort of the X-ray binary phase. But right now, we're focused just on the mass transfer phase. And here I'm going to show, now that I've described the time series for the mass, you can see what I was describing in words before, the rotational evolution. So the secondary gets spun up very rapidly due to this mass transfer. And this rapid rotation actually rejects a significant fraction of the mass that's transferred. And then it essentially has some birth spin that evolves during the detached phase, where this system in particular would appear as a Be-XRB binary in our models. And as I mentioned before, this binary in particular undergoes a second phase of mass transfer from a stripped helium star. We often refer to this as case BB, for those who know about these mass transfer phases. But a significant fraction of our population go through this phase. And so what this would imply is that a huge fraction of these binaries have a phase, first of all, have a phase where there's a stripped helium star and a BE star. So these are like SDO BE binaries. And from this rotationally limited accretion, that there would be a significant amounts of CSM in the surrounding vicinity of the binary. So once the primary undergoes the supernova, it has the potential to create a CSM interacting supernova, like a superluminous supernova, for example. So these systems are very interesting. I mentioned before that a significant fraction of this mass is lost to CSM because of rotationally limited accretion. And we've tried to quantify how efficient this mass transfer is at a population level. And that's what this PDF is showing, where 1 means that all of the mass that was transferred from the primary is accepted by the secondary, and 0 is like none of it is actually accreted. And so you can see the baseline, this sort of tan distribution, is again every compact object plus star binary, a potential X-ray binary system. And then the black distribution is our Be-XRB binary population. And the point being here is that the mass transfer efficiency we find, first of all, is a distribution. If you're familiar with standard binary population synthesis models, this is a singular number that is set for every binary interaction in your entire population. But so as far as I know, for the first time, we're looking at a distribution of mass transfer efficiencies. And we get this peak basically at 5%. So one of our conclusions is essentially that this implies that mass transfer is highly non-conservative, and we have some motivation for stating this due to our modeling of the rotation and limiting it to subcritical. So that's all the time I think I have for making points about this project. We do more studies in the paper, and we're trying to publish this soon. I'm gonna, again, highlight the fact that this self-consistent rotational modeling has proven really successful for matching the galactic Be X-ray binaries. We're interested in looking at sort of the metallicity evolution in future studies, or implications for, as I mentioned, maybe the CSM interacting supernovae and rates for these things. And that's it. Thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Kyle. This is really, really wonderful work, and really, really nice talk presenting it. So we do already have a first couple of questions in the chat. I noticed that Myron is still online. So Myron, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself to ask them, or if I should just ask them out loud on your behalf.
Go ahead and read them. That's fine.
Okay, so the first question is for the initial mass transfer onto the BE star, are you able to predict the internal rotational distribution within the BE star, or do you simply make assumption for that redistribution?
That's a good question. So inside of POSYDON, we have these detailed binary models with MESA. Those models, we do have a profile, a rotational profile. So we don't have to assume solid body, for example. And I'm trying to think, because it's a huge data intensive thing to keep the rotational profile at every phase of evolution, we only have it at specific times. But once we transition to the X-ray binary phase, we do have to switch in modeling where we have to assume solid body rotation. So we kind of transition between being able to use these binary MESA models and then switching between the single star models. It's kind of like a hybrid approach. So it depends on where you want the rotational profile, is my answer.
Thank you.
And then the second question from Myron was for the late evolution BE plus pulsar systems, are you able to predict the so-called Corbett relation between the orbital and pulsar spin periods?
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't specifically look at the pulsar, yeah, sort of this Corbett process, because what I didn't talk about a lot is that there's a big question about the morphology, or not the morphology, like the details of the disks in these systems. And this sets both the X-ray luminosity, so it can determine what parts of your population are you consider X-ray bright. What is the duty cycle of this disk? And I'm bringing this up because that would also determine the mass accretion onto the neutron star. And so there's big uncertainties for the disk modeling there. And we did not look at it for this project in particular. But yeah, I think in the future, someone in our collaboration in POSYDON is actually doing general pulsar modeling. They're doing some development in the code to allow some more complex pulsar modeling. And so maybe in the future, this is something that we can look at reproducing.
Sounds like you have your work cut out for you. Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Okay, next we have Mark with his hand raised.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Kyle. I was just curious, on slide, I think it was slide 20, you mentioned of course, one of the criteria for detecting a Be X-ray binary would need to be that the periastron radius is within the disk radius in your code there. I was just curious if you could briefly describe what sort of a model do you use to determine the disk radius for a given BE star?
Yes, great question. So so in binary population synthesis studies, it seems that everyone chooses a different disk model. And so this is a good question. What we actually end up using for this study is the sonic radius. So we assume some equation of state for the disk, some disk profile, and this is based off of this study here, this 2011 paper, where they sort of argue that the maximum, like a conservative estimate, the maximum disk radius that you should have for a viscously coupled disk is the sonic radius, because beyond that point, like the thermal energy is comparable to the escape velocity. So the argument is like you just break viscous coupling beyond that radius, but this gives you disk radii that are very large compared to observed disk radii that are like more like 100 stellar radii. But we actually check this in the paper. We compare two different disk models, and we kind of find that it's not so sensitive to at least to the disk models that are used in the literature for binary population synthesis. it doesn't affect much this interaction criteria.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, the sensitivity was going to be my next question. So thank you. I'll look in the paper for that discussion. Thank you very much.
All right. Are there any other questions for Kyle? Maybe I'll use my... Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dimitri.
Thank you. Very nice talk. Very thought-inspiring. What have you assumed for the acericity of the neutrino ejection during the supernova explosion?
So
because
yeah,
that determines the kick. And for instance, people have argued that when you have an electron capture supernova, this is rather spherical and the eccentricity should be small, and people have tried to model the distribution of eccentricities and have claimed a good agreement.
Yeah, that's a good question. For this study, I would say you were mentioning specifically the asymmetry of neutrino emission. Is that correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember if the model we're using in particular considers this, but yeah, you mentioned this kind of like low kick population. We have a diversity of kick magnitudes that we're drawing. There's like the standard Maxwellian with the, I think it's like 256 kilometers per second distribution, and then I think we also have this like low kick electron capture supernova kick model. But I do know that in other studies they vary this kick prescription, and this is what they're trying to compare with the models. In this study in particular, we were saying like, just, you know, one iteration, let's not turn all of the standard knobs and pops in. We say that we're modeling these new things. Does it actually complete the picture in terms of, can we match with one iteration?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Kyle? All right. Well, I think we've just reached the hour mark. So Kyle, once again, thank you so much for giving this really nice talk. I think you've generated some really interesting discussion here. And just as a quick reminder for everyone, we'll be having our February seminar, and I'll be sending details very soon about this to everyone. So thanks everyone for connecting. Thanks, Kyle, for this really nice talk, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks.
Thanks for having me.